She called the police on him 23 times. She sent child welfare investigators to his front door twice. She filed 9 county inspection complaints in a single season, arranged for a fire marshal to appear on a Tuesday morning while he was drinking coffee on his own porch, and once persuaded an environmental officer to show up unannounced, while his daughter sat at the kitchen table working through a math worksheet with her pencil behind her ear. She did all of this with the full confidence of a woman who had never once faced a consequence she hadn't engineered herself, who moved through the world with the quiet, operationalized certainty of someone who had learned that pressure applied consistently, through the right institutional channels, by someone who understood how those channels worked, would eventually produce any result she needed. What Victoria Haze did not know, and what she could not have known, because she had never looked closely enough at the man she was trying to destroy to understand what he actually was that Ethan Brooks had spent 17 years of his professional life watching people exactly like her make exactly this mistake. He didn't argue with her. He didn't threaten her. He didn't sell the house and move on, which was presumably the outcome she considered most efficient and most likely. He installed cameras, kept records, and waited with the particular patience of someone who has learned through long practice that evidence accumulates on its own timeline, and that the investigator's job is not to accelerate that timeline but to be ready when it concludes. And in the end, his patience sent her to prison. Ethan Brooks was 44 years old when he left the Federal Investigative Service, and he left it the way that a lot of good people leave institutions that have slowly stopped being worth the personal cost of maintaining them. Not in anger, not exactly, more like the quiet, settled exhaustion of a man who has spent years doing work he believes in inside a structure that has gradually revealed itself to be primarily interested in its own continuation rather than its stated purpose. He had spent nearly 2 decades building cases on fraud, municipal corruption, and the particular category of financial crime that hides in plain sight inside the administrative machinery of ordinary-seeming institutions, the kind that require a specific mind to detect, one that can sit with incomplete information for months, even years, assembling the shape of something invisible from the scattered circumstantial evidence of its edges. He was good at this. He was among the best the department had produced, according to the internal reviews conducted at 3-year intervals, and for a long time he had taken those assessments seriously because the work produced results that seemed to justify them. Then the results started getting quietly reassigned whenever they created complications for people who sat above the complications, and the cases he built started dying in administrative channels he couldn't see into. And one afternoon Ethan sat at his desk looking at a case file, and understood with complete clarity that he was spending his professional energy keeping a broken system running so that it could continue ignoring what he handed it. He submitted his resignation the next morning. His supervisor told him he was making a serious mistake and throwing away everything he had built. Ethan thanked him sincerely for the time they had worked together, took the personal items from his drawer, and drove home through the late afternoon traffic without turning on the radio or calling anyone. He found the White Pine Lake property through a listing so spare it barely registered as 8 acres, lakefront access, cabin structure, needs work. The photographs showed a wooden building that had clearly been loved and then slowly, incompletely let go, a structure whose proportions still communicated the genuine intention behind its original construction, with a back porch that faced directly into the lake view without any obstruction, and a roofline that followed the slight rise of the land in a way that looked considered rather than arbitrary. The dock in the photos leaned about 10 degrees to the left. The shoreline was so quiet that you could imagine the sound of the water just from looking at the image. Ethan drove up alone on a Thursday in early spring, walked the full 8-acre perimeter in rubber boots, while the last of the snowmelt ran in thin silver channels between the exposed pine roots, breathed the cold, clean smell of the lake and the pine needles, and the particular mineral sharpness of Montana spring air, and called his wife Sarah from the dock. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. Sarah could hear, in the quality of the silence that sat behind his voice before he spoke, what it meant. They had been married long enough that she could read the particular silences as clearly as the words. They made an offer on the property that weekend. It was accepted on Monday morning. Sarah worked as a financial compliance officer for a regional bank, a role that had become fully remote in the years before they moved, and that required nothing more spatially demanding than a reliable internet connection and a room with a door that could be closed when calls required focus. White Pine Lake provided both, along with a view from her home office window that changed with the seasons in ways that no suburban window had ever offered her. Their daughter Emma was 11 years old, quick and physically capable and possessed of the kind of adaptability that some children carry as a native quality that doesn't need to be cultivated. She had her kayak on the lake within the first week of moving in, and within a month she knew the common names of the birds that nested along the eastern shoreline and could identify different fish species by the pattern their rises made on the surface of the water in the late afternoon. She adapted to White Pine Lake the way certain children adapt to changes that are genuinely right for them, completely, immediately, and without any apparent nostalgia for what had been left behind. Ethan spent his first weeks there, stripping old varnish from a 1960s mahogany motorboat he had found in the storage shed behind the cabin, a runabout of the kind that people once restored with great patience and great care, and then sometimes abandoned partway through when the rest of their life overtook the project. The work was slow and physical, and demanded exactly no strategic thinking, no long-range assessment, no reading of institutional patterns or human behavior, nothing, in other words, that his professional life had required of him for nearly 2 decades. He was genuinely, uncomplicatedly happy, which was a condition he had not experienced consistently in years. Then the notice appeared on a Wednesday morning, and the uncomplicated quality of the happiness acquired a layer of something more familiar. The notice was tucked under the windshield wiper of his truck, which was parked in his own driveway on his own property. Printed on official HOA letterhead in the specific combination of formal authority and implied menace that people who draft such documents have refined over long practice. It informed Ethan Brooks that his property fell within the recorded boundaries of the White Pine Lake Homeowners Association. That membership in the association was mandatory under applicable covenants recorded with the county recorder's office, that his annual dues of $6,000 were currently past due for the full calendar year, and that failure to achieve compliance within 30 days would result in enforcement action, including but not limited to referrals to county zoning and the imposition of property liens. 3 pages of association rules were attached, covering exterior paint color restrictions, permissible height limits for lakefront vegetation, permitted dimensions for personal watercraft, required submission processes for structural modifications, allowable hours for power tools, noise restrictions after 9 in the evening, and approximately 40 additional categories of residential behavior the association considered within its authority to govern. Ethan read the notice carefully and then placed it on the passenger seat and drove to the county records office, where he obtained current certified copies of the property deed, the county parcel map, and the recorded HOA boundary documentation. All documents he had already reviewed thoroughly before purchasing the property, because reviewing such documents was simply how Ethan Brooks approached any transaction involving real property, and he had done it here as he had done it everywhere else. His land sat outside the HOA's recorded boundary by approximately 40 feet at its nearest point. The notice was not an administrative error. Administrative errors do not arrive with payment instructions and a structured compliance timeline. He did not have to wait long before the person behind the notice came in person. 3 days after the windshield notice, a car turned into his driveway that he didn't recognize, and a woman climbed out of it who moved with the ease of someone for whom the word no had long since become, in practice, more of an opening position than a final determination. Victoria Haze was 58 years old, dressed in a belted linen blazer over a silk blouse, despite the morning chill that still settled along the lakeshore in early autumn, carrying a clipboard with the air of someone for whom the clipboard was as much an accessory of authority as it was a practical tool. She introduced herself as the president of the White Pine Lake Homeowners Association before Ethan had finished opening the front door, and she began speaking without waiting for an invitation, delivering what was clearly a practiced and frequently deployed presentation about community standards, unified waterfront governance, the infrastructure improvements the association had funded along the shared lakeshore, and what she called the fundamental obligations attendant on owning lakeside property within an established residential community. She was composed and articulate and entirely certain that she was speaking to a man who would eventually comply, simply because the energy required to do otherwise would exceed the energy required to write a check and accept the rules. She had used this approach many times. It worked most of the time. Ethan listened to all of it without saying anything. He had cultivated this particular skill over 17 years, the ability to allow someone to fully commit to a position before responding to it, to let them go entirely out on the limb before pointing out, with perfect calm, that the limb had been cut. When Victoria Haze reached the natural conclusion of her presentation, he asked her to wait a moment, went inside, and returned with the certified parcel map, the recorded HOA boundary documentation, and the 1-page letter from his property attorney, confirming that his land fell outside the HOA's legal jurisdiction by a documented and verifiable margin. He placed these documents on the porch railing between them and walked her through each one in the measured, deliberate tone of a person who has delivered inconvenient facts to powerful people in high-stakes professional settings and has learned that the delivery matters almost as much as the content. His property was not within the HOA's legal jurisdiction. Membership could not be compelled under the recorded covenants. He had confirmed this interpretation with counsel before the purchase, and had been confirmed in it again since receiving the notice. Victoria Haze looked at the documents for a long moment. Something moved behind her eyes, not embarrassment, which would have required some element of genuine surprise, but the rapid, silent recalculation of a person who has run into a well-prepared obstacle and is already in the process of reorganizing around it. She smiled, said she would need to review the boundary question with the association's own attorney, picked up her clipboard from the railing, and walked back toward her car with the same unhurried confidence with which she had arrived. But before she got in, she stopped. Ethan noticed this because he was still watching, in the way he always watched without appearing to. As a habit so ingrained it had long since passed below the level of deliberate choice, a quality of continuous peripheral attention that registered small details the way a compass needle registers magnetic north, automatically, precisely, without needing to think about it. Her gaze moved past him, past the cabin, past the truck in the driveway, past the storage shed, all the way to the back of the property where the land dropped gently toward the water and his dock extended out over the lake surface in the pale autumn morning light. She looked at the shoreline for approximately 4 full seconds longer than any normal reading of the situation could account for. Then she got in the car, backed out of the driveway, and drove away. Ethan stood on the porch after the sound of her engine had faded and the sounds of the lake had filled back in the distant call of a bird, the lap of water against the dock pilings, the wind through the pines along the property line. He stood there with the certified parcel map still in his hand and thought about those 4 seconds. Small things tell you where to look. He went inside and opened his notebook. The first police call came 9 days after Victoria's visit. A deputy arrived at 7:30 in the morning, while Ethan was in the storage shed working on the motorboat, responding to a report of possible illegal occupancy of the White Pine Lake property. The deputy was courteous and efficient and visibly practiced at calls that resolved without incident. He inspected Ethan's deed and photo identification, walked the visible exterior of the property, noted in his report that the residence was lawfully occupied by its titled owner, and left within 20 minutes with a mild professional apology for the interruption. The second call came a week later, a noise complaint about power tools before the permissible morning hour, investigated and dismissed. The third alleged unpermitted construction, requiring more coordination but resolved without incident once Ethan produced the documented permits for the deck repair he had completed in June. By the 5th visit, the deputies who rotated through the White Pine Lake addresses on dispatch were starting to recognize the property. By the 8th, one name was appearing with increasing regularity on the incident reports: Deputy Ryan Cooper, 29, assigned to the county sheriff's office, who had taken to requesting the White Pine Lake calls when they came through dispatch whenever he was in a position to do so. Ryan was deliberate and observant and possessed of a professional discomfort that Ethan recognized and respected, the discomfort of a person who sees a pattern emerging and is not comfortable being the instrument through which it operates, even when his role is technically correct. He didn't editorialize on the early visits. He arrived, he documented, he departed, but his pattern of arrival was itself a form of communication. After the 12th call, a fire safety inspection triggered by an anonymous tip alleging improper storage of flammable materials in a residential outbuilding, Ryan Cooper stood beside his cruiser in Ethan's driveway, while the inspector concluded his walkthrough inside the shed, and the 2 men stood in the morning quiet without speaking for a moment, watching the inspector's silhouette move past the shed window. Then Ryan said, in the considered manner of someone who has been thinking about how to phrase something for several visits and has finally decided to say it plainly, "It looks to me like somebody is working to build a record against you." He didn't elaborate. He didn't offer a theory, name a suspect, or suggest a course of action. He didn't need to. It was one professional identifying a pattern that another professional had been watching develop since the first week, and the statement functioned less as information. Ethan already had the information than as the acknowledgement that someone else in a position of official standing had seen what he was seeing and found it as irregular as he did. That kind of acknowledgement carries weight, even when it changes nothing practical. Ethan thanked him. Ryan got in his cruiser and drove away. Ethan stood in the driveway for a moment after the sound of the engine faded, then went inside and added the fire safety inspection to the log he was keeping in the kitchen notebook. The log had grown too long for one notebook. He opened a second and continued. The child welfare visits altered the emotional nature of the situation, and Ethan felt the alteration immediately in the moment he saw Sarah's face in the front doorway when the caseworker knocked. The caseworker was professional and visibly uncomfortable with the nature of the complaint she was obligated to investigate it. Alleged that the Brooks' minor child was being regularly left unsupervised in the proximity of open plaint People-a-Sen. Water, that the home environment presented multiple safety concerns, and that the parent's capacity to provide adequate care was in question. Sarah brought her inside with the composed steadiness of someone who maintains their exterior as a professional habit, and Ethan could see from across the kitchen what maintaining it cost. Emma looked up from her homework and asked what was going on. Sarah told her someone from the county was doing a routine check, nothing to be concerned about. Emma considered this assessment for a moment, looking at her mother's face, and then looked back down at her notebook. An act that was either trust or its own form of composure, and Ethan wasn't sure which, and it troubled him that he wasn't sure. The investigation found nothing. It was closed in 10 days. A second complaint was filed the following month with similar allegations, and was closed within 2 weeks of the first visit. But Ethan had been in the room for both caseworker visits, watching Emma's face in the moments when an adult she didn't know walked through the rooms of their home asking questions about her parents' fitness to raise her, and what he saw there was not fear. Emma was not easily frightened by ordinary things, but the beginning of a more layered awareness. The awareness that the world outside the property line could reach in without warning, without cause, without any action on their part that had invited it. He stood in the hallway that night and looked through the open door at the shape of his daughter asleep under the blanket, and he made a decision that he didn't need to say out loud because it was already made. He had been defending. He would now investigate. He started with the HOA's public financial disclosures, available from the county recorder's office through standard public records provisions. They were not detailed enough to be conclusively incriminating on their face, but they were detailed enough for someone trained to read institutional financial documents to see the outline of something that didn't follow normal patterns expenditure categories so broadly defined they could absorb. Irregular payments without generating obvious questions, infrastructure budget lines that referenced improvements along the lakeshore for which no physical evidence existed, and a legal services line in the current fiscal year that was nearly 4 times the prior year's figure, with no visible corresponding increase in legal activity. He submitted a formal records request for 3 years of meeting minutes from the HOA board. He cross-referenced the association's membership roll against county property records to identify all board members by name and parcel. He ran systematic background research on each board member and on Victoria Haze in particular, using the same methodology he had applied to corporate officers during federal investigations. Victoria's profile returned unremarkable by standard metrics: longtime resident, a career in real estate sales and property management, active in local civic organizations, no criminal history. But the real estate background held his attention, the way that specific details sometimes hold the attention of investigators who have learned to trust the particular pull of professional relevance. People with deep real estate experience do not generally volunteer to manage HOA governance because they enjoy the administrative work. They do it because they understand what the governance controls and what the governance can be used to influence. The critical document arrived through a public records request he almost hadn't made a planning commission filing submitted to the county 6 months before Ethan purchased his property, included in a routine batch of zoning applications. Unremarkable unless you read the parcel descriptions carefully enough to understand the geography they were describing. The filing was a preliminary concept application for a mixed-use lakefront development, a private marina with capacity for approximately 40 watercraft, a resort hotel of approximately 80 guest rooms with amenities oriented toward high-end recreational tourism, and a private dock facility intended to service watercraft in the luxury category. The development company applying was registered in Delaware and had no public profile outside its regulatory filings, represented locally by a planning consultant with a long regional history of working on similar projects. The parcel coordinates included in the application identified the specific point along the White Pine Lake shoreline where the development required unobstructed lakefront access. Ethan held the Planning Commission document in one hand and the county parcel map in the other and compared the coordinates. The required access point sat on the rear boundary of his 8-acre property. He set both documents on the kitchen table and sat with what he was seeing for several minutes, assembling the shape of it with the particular methodical care of someone who has learned that the first complete picture is rarely the one that holds up under scrutiny. But this one held up. His property was not incidental to somebody's business plan. His property was the single unresolved element standing between that plan and its execution. The financial connection between Victoria Haze and the development company came through a chain of documentary evidence that required patience and systematic work but no techniques beyond what any person was legally entitled to use. A recorded easement agreement retrieved from the county recorder's office showed Victoria Haze, in her signed capacity as HOA president, granting the development company access rights along the White Pine Lake shoreline, access rights that were legally meaningless without Ethan's cooperation or absence, but that had been recorded in the official registry as though they were valid and established. The recording predated his first HOA notice by 8 months. Someone had paid for that signature in advance of any access having been secured. Tracing the development company through its registered agent filings in Delaware and through a civil disclosure from an unrelated proceeding in another state produced the confirmation: a wire transfer of $75,000 sent from the development company's operating account to a personal checking account held in the name of Victoria M. Haze, dated 11 months before the notice appeared on Ethan's windshield. He printed the transfer record. He placed it in the folder on the shelf in his home office. The folder was becoming heavy. November brought an acceleration that was recognizable as desperation once you understood the deadline. Buried in the development company's amended planning commission filing was a commitment to the county, a fully executed and legally uncontested access agreement, delivered by the end of the following year's first quarter. The clock had been running for months. It had approximately 4 months left. Victoria Haze had accepted $75,000 to deliver an outcome that depended on removing or neutralizing the occupant of a specific property, and the occupant had not cooperated with any of the mechanisms she had deployed to accomplish that. The frequency of the official visits escalated. A building inspector on Monday, an environmental compliance officer on Wednesday, a fire marshal on Friday, another building inspector the following Tuesday. Every day brought someone new. Ryan Cooper began appearing on some of these visits uninvited, parking at the edge of the driveway in his personal vehicle and observing without intervening a presence that communicated, without requiring words, that someone with official standing was watching what was happening. On a Thursday night in mid-November, Ethan's wireless camera system registered signal interference at 2:17 in the morning. He had anticipated exactly this. He had installed 4 additional hardwired cameras in the preceding weeks, positioned to cover the dock area and the rear property perimeter from angles that were not immediately visible to anyone scanning the exterior for surveillance equipment. He watched from the bedroom window and on the monitor beside the bed as 3 figures moved along the tree line at the back of the property, carrying 2 large plastic containers. They brought the containers to the dock area, set them at the water's edge, and retreated without speaking. Ethan watched the full sequence on the hardwired feed, then went back to sleep. Before 6 the following morning, wearing nitrile gloves, he photographed the containers from multiple angles, recorded their location with GPS coordinates, and moved them to a locked cabinet in the storage shed. The environmental inspector arrived at 8:45 with a county compliance officer and a formally documented complaint alleging chemical contamination of the lakefront. They searched the dock area and the shoreline for 40 minutes and found a clean waterfront. The inspector filed a no-violation report. Victoria Haze received that result sometime that afternoon. Ethan did not need to be present in that room to understand what it cost her. 3 nights after the environmental setup attempt, the fire started at the storage shed. Ethan smelled the accelerant before the smoke alarm triggered and was out the back door with the extinguisher inside 90 seconds, killing the blaze in under 4 minutes before it spread beyond the exterior wall. The motorboat inside was completely untouched. The fire department arrived, conducted their investigation, and confirmed deliberate ignition. At the back corner of the shed, apparently dropped in the retreat, was a partially burned work glove that the fire investigator bagged as evidence. Ethan's hardwired camera had captured the arson from the moment of ignition through the figure's departure gray hooded sweatshirt, work boots of a specific and identifiable model, a gait and build and manner of movement that matched the profile he had already assembled on Tyler Haze, 26 years old, Victoria Haze's nephew, whose documented employment history with seasonal HOA maintenance contractors gave him regular and expected access to the lakeshore properties. Ethan documented the identification assessment as exactly that, an assessment, not a conclusion, with the specific basis and its limitations clearly noted, and added it to the folder. The attack on Sarah in December was the most precisely targeted thing Victoria Haze had done throughout the entire campaign, and its precision told Ethan that she was either receiving professional strategic advice from someone with experience in this category of damage, or that the operational intelligence she had developed over a long career in real estate had finally applied itself fully to the problem of what would cause the most lasting harm with the least visible exposure. A formal misconduct complaint arrived at Sarah's employer through the bank's official compliance reporting channel, alleging that Sarah Brooks had submitted falsified compliance documentation over a period of years, had manipulated internal audit records, and had misrepresented her professional credentials in her original employment application. The complaint was specific enough in its allegations, specific enough to have required genuine knowledge of Sarah's professional role and institutional context to trigger an immediate internal review process and place her on administrative leave pending its outcome. She told Ethan about it at the kitchen table that evening, her hands around a cup of tea that was cooling untouched in front of her, her voice steady in the specific way of someone who is maintaining steadiness as a deliberate act rather than a natural state. He listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he told her, the review would find nothing because there was nothing to find, and he was going to identify the source of the complaint, and the person responsible was going to face consequences considerably more serious than anything they had tried to create for her. He said both of these things in the even tone of a man making statements rather than promises, because he already knew one of them was certain and had a specific working hypothesis about the other. The metadata embedded in the electronic complaint documents, obtained through Sarah's attorney in the course of the internal review, told the story with the precision that digital documents carry when no one has thought to sanitize them. The authoring workstation was registered to the White Pine Lake Homeowners Association Administrative Office. The account credentials belonged to the HOA's administrative secretary. The document creation timestamps placed the composition on a Sunday evening, after business hours. The HOA's administrative secretary was documented, through photographs timestamped by 3 different people on 3 different devices, to have been present at a family gathering 40 miles away throughout the evening in question. Someone had used her credentials at the HOA office while she was verifiably elsewhere. He printed the metadata analysis and added it to the folder. Then he sat at the kitchen table for an hour and designed the trap, because the folder was now complete, and the trap was the final procedural step. He left the storage shed door unlocked on a Friday evening, something he had never done before, a departure from his normal pattern that anyone watching the property would register as an anomaly. Through the shed window, clearly visible from outside under the work lamp he left burning, was a manila folder propped on the workbench labeled in large block handwritten letters, Victoria Haze Corruption Evidence. Inside the folder were printed copies of publicly available county records, interleaved with several pages of text that contained no information of any actionable value material, designed to waste the time of whoever reviewed it, and to communicate nothing useful. He confirmed hardwired camera coverage of the shed from all 4 angles, told Emma he would be up for another hour if she needed anything, and went to bed at 10:30. The figure appeared on the feed at 1:48 in the morning, moving through the dark toward the shed with the slightly overconfident bearing of someone who has rationalized the risk into something he has decided is acceptable. He entered through the unlocked door, went directly to the workbench with no hesitation, picked up the folder, stood at the bench for approximately 3 minutes reviewing its contents under the work lamp, then tucked it under his arm and left the way he came. Ethan watched the entire sequence on the bedroom monitor with the light off. He identified Logan Haze, 31 years old, Victoria's son, whose name appeared as a signatory on 2 HOA board resolutions Ethan had obtained months earlier, before he completed the formal footage review the following morning. Clean hardwired footage, well lit, multiple angles. Logan Haze entering a private structure without authorization and removing property not belonging to him in the direct service of a campaign against the Brooks household that was now documented from beginning to end. He added the footage to the folder. The folder was now complete. He assembled the formal submission package over 4 methodical days, working the way he had worked on federal prosecution files, not simply accumulating evidence, but organizing it in the precise form that required the least possible interpretive labor from the people who would receive it, because the quality of the organization is as important as the quality of the underlying evidence when you are asking an institution to act. The package contained the complete chronological index of all 23 police and inspection incidents with corresponding camera footage, the environmental staging footage with GPS documentation and timing analysis, the fire footage with the Tyler Haze identification assessment and its stated basis and limitations, the shed break-in footage with the Logan Haze documentation, the metadata analysis of the forged complaint submitted to Sarah's employer, the $75,000 wire transfer record, the recorded easement agreement, the planning commission filing, and a 30-page summary memorandum in plain declarative prose that laid out the full causal chain from Victoria Haze's financial arrangement with the development company through every subsequent action taken against the Brooks family, with every evidentiary link identified, sourced, and cross-referenced. He sent the complete package simultaneously on a Tuesday evening to the county prosecutor's office, the county sheriff's investigative division, the state attorney general's financial crimes unit, and the FBI field office with regional jurisdiction, the last because the interstate wire transfers created federal exposure, and because Ethan had former colleagues there who would recognize the quality of the work immediately and ensure that it reached the right people at the right level. The response developed over the following week in the measured institutional cadences of agencies that take serious matters seriously. An automated acknowledgement arrived from the county prosecutor's office on Wednesday morning. A message from the Sheriff's Investigative Division came Thursday, left on voicemail, saying the submission was under active review and that contact would follow. On Monday, a 40-minute call from the FBI field office produced a conversation that ended with the agent saying something Ethan recognized from 17 years of being on the other side of such calls. "We have what we need to move forward." He thanked the agent, ended the call, and went back to the storage shed. The final coat of varnish on the motorboat was curing cleanly and evenly. In a few more days it would be ready for the water. The arrests happened on a Tuesday in late January, when the lake surface was flat and pewter gray under a sky that was still deciding whether to deliver snow. Ethan was on the porch with his coffee at 5:55 when the first dark government SUV appeared at the far end of the road, moving slowly with the particular deliberate pace of vehicles carrying people who are in no hurry because the outcome has already been determined. A second SUV followed, then a third. Ryan Cooper's county cruiser came last in the convoy, which Ethan understood was deliberate and correct. Ryan had requested to be included and had been given a supporting role, and he had chosen the trailing position not because it was assigned, but because he understood, at some level, what this particular morning represented for the people whose driveway he had sat outside of 12 times, and he wanted to approach it with the gravity it deserved. Ethan watched the convoy from the porch and finished his coffee. They arrived at Victoria Haze's residence at 6:12. She came to the door before anyone knocked, apparently already awake and working at her kitchen table when the vehicles pulled up outside, which told Ethan, when he heard this later, that some part of her had understood for some time that this morning was coming and had simply refused, in the way that people who have spent their lives bending institutions to their purposes sometimes refuse, to fully believe that the institution could turn around and come for them. She looked at the search warrant and then the arrest warrant, and stood in her doorway for a long moment without speaking. And then she looked past the agents and past Ryan, down the road in the direction the lake lay, and whatever she was calculating or acknowledging or grieving in that moment was not something anyone standing there felt the need to name. She said, "This is Ethan Brooks. This is entirely something Ethan Brooks has done to me." Ryan Cooper, who had been present at 12 of the 23 incidents, who had stood in the driveway of the Brooks property, while inspectors searched for code violations that didn't exist, and caseworkers asked questions about a child who was perfectly fine and a family that had done nothing except buy a house on a lake, looked at Victoria Haze with the patience of someone who has already settled the question in his own mind and said, "Ma'am, you did this yourself." Ethan Brooks documented it. The board members who had participated in the conspiracy were arrested the same morning at their respective residences. Tyler Haze was taken into custody at his apartment. Logan Haze turned himself in before noon, accompanied by an attorney, after what Ryan Cooper would later describe in his report as a call that appeared unsurprising and voluntary. The HOA administrative offices were searched and produced the workstation and associated records that confirmed the forgery of the misconduct complaint submitted to Sarah's employer. The development company's legal representatives filed a formal withdrawal of their planning commission application within 48 hours of the arrests, a development that required no elaboration. The HOA board convened an emergency meeting the following week and voted unanimously to accept the resignation of all officers who had served during Victoria's tenure and to formally request county-supervised governance oversight and audit. Sarah's employer completed its internal review, cleared her record entirely, issued a written apology acknowledging that the complaint had been fabricated, and restored her to her position without condition. Victoria Haze was charged with wire fraud, extortion, forgery, criminal conspiracy, and bribery in connection with a public proceeding. Tyler Haze faced arson and criminal conspiracy charges. Logan Haze received a suspended sentence with probation after a plea arrangement that involved his cooperation. The development company's legal team withdrew the planning commission application within 48 hours of the arrests, quietly and without public statement. The HOA board convened an emergency meeting the following week and voted unanimously to accept the resignation of all officers who had served during Victoria's tenure and to formally request county-supervised governance oversight and a comprehensive financial audit covering the past 4 years. Sarah's employer completed its internal review, cleared her record entirely, issued a written apology acknowledging that the complaint had been fabricated by an external party, and restored her to her full position without condition and without the kind of lingering institutional wariness that sometimes follows even a cleared accusation. Victoria's sentencing, which took place in early spring when the ice on White Pine Lake had broken up and the water had shifted from the pewter gray of winter to the deep cold green that would warm to gold by June, produced a term of 6 years in federal prison. On the primary charges, reduced from the maximum available under the wire fraud statutes by a plea arrangement that involved cooperation with the investigators examining the development company's activities across multiple states, a parallel investigation that Ethan had no direct involvement in and followed only with the detached professional interest of someone who understands that the cases you build rarely end with the single person you built them against, that the threads lead outward, and that other investigators will follow them to conclusions of their own. He did not attend the sentencing. He was not asked to. He had done his part when he assembled the package and sent it to the right people. What happened after that was the process doing what the process existed to do. Emma won the district science fair with her model of a layered security camera network. Her presentation to the panel of judges included a clean schematic diagram demonstrating how overlapping camera fields eliminate coverage gaps in a protected perimeter, and she had built the model itself with genuine precision. The camera housings were to scale, the cable routing was accurate, and the coverage zone diagram she had drawn by hand on graph paper was the kind of thing that a working security professional would have recognized as correct without being told that an 11-year-old made it. She explained the principles of overlapping coverage with the easy fluency of someone who has been watching a specific kind of problem-solving happen in close proximity for several months and has absorbed its principles without being explicitly taught them, the way children absorb things that matter in the household they grow up in. One of the judges asked her where she had learned so much about security system design. She thought about it for a moment and then said, "My dad taught me that you document everything, and then you wait." The other judges smiled. The ribbon she received was blue. Ethan put it on the refrigerator when she brought it home that evening, and it stayed there through the rest of the spring and into the summer, and he never moved it. On the morning of Victoria's sentencing, Ethan was on the porch with his coffee in the early light before the sun had cleared the ridge to the east. A pair of loons moved along the far shoreline of the lake, their calls carrying across the still water with the clear resonance that cold morning air produces. He did not feel the need to be present in the courthouse. He did not feel triumphant in any way that needed expression, or vindicated in any way that required acknowledgement from anyone else. He felt the specific, durable calm of a person who responded correctly to what the situation required, who did not escalate when escalation was being deliberately and systematically invited, who held still and kept the record and let the evidence accumulate without trying to accelerate it, and who then organized that evidence into the form that allowed the process to work the way the process was supposed to work when the people involved did it right. He had done what his experience and his judgment told him to do. The outcome had followed from the work. Sarah came out with her own coffee and took the chair beside him. Emma was still asleep inside. The loons had moved out toward the center of the lake. The water caught the first angle of the morning light and held it in long, slow streaks that shifted as the surface shifted. They sat together without needing to speak, watching the lake do what it did every morning, which was simply exist permanent and indifferent and unaffected by the events of the past several months, unbothered by the question of who had tried to claim a piece of its shoreline. The motorboat was in the water now, the mahogany gleaming under its final coat of varnish, tied to the repaired dock that no longer leaned to the left. There would be time to take it out today. There would be time for all of it. Peace is not something the world offers by default, and it is not a condition that maintains itself simply because you have earned the right to it or because you want it enough. There will always be people who look at someone else's stillness and see only something they have not yet disturbed. The answer to that, the only answer that holds over time, that cannot be appealed or eroded or waited out, is the one Ethan Brooks had carried with him since his first year in federal service, and that the past 6 months had done nothing to change. When someone forces a confrontation, the only leverage that reliably lasts is the truth, documented precisely, preserved carefully, and placed in the right hands at the right moment, by someone patient enough to do the work correctly, and thorough enough to do it completely. He had done that here. He would do it again, if it ever became necessary. But sitting on the porch of his lakeside cabin on a quiet Montana morning in early spring, with the water turning gold and his daughter's alarm sounding faintly through the wall and his wife's hand resting near his on the arm of the chair, he did not believe it would become necessary again. He believed he was home, and that this time, no one was going to take that from him. The weeks that followed the arrests had their own texture, quieter than the months before them, but not quite the same as the ordinary quiet that had existed before Victoria Haze drove into his driveway for the first time. There was a period of paperwork and follow-up requests from the county prosecutor's office, questions about chain of custody for the camera footage and the container evidence, a brief deposition that Ethan gave one morning in the courthouse, building in the county seat in a room with a long table and a court reporter and 2 attorneys who asked him questions he had anticipated and answered with precision. Ryan Cooper stopped by the property once during this period, not on official business, with a thermos of coffee and about 20 minutes of his time, and they sat on the dock and looked at the water and talked about fishing spots along the lake's northern reaches in the way that two people talk when they don't need to say the thing they are both thinking. The charges were solid. The evidence was thorough. The process, for once, was doing what it was designed to do without requiring anyone to push it. Sarah's return to her professional work happened without ceremony, which was how she preferred it. She was back at her desk within a week of the employer's apology, conducting a compliance review that had been waiting during her leave, and the colleagues who had worked alongside her during the administrative leave period treated her return with the practical normalcy of people who had never believed the complaint in the first place, and were relieved that the institution had ultimately confirmed what they already knew. Bed. Emma started the new semester with a presentation on loon migration patterns for her natural science class, a project she had been developing over the winter by documenting the birds she watched from the dock each morning in a field notebook that Ethan had given her, and which she kept with the same careful regularity that he kept his own logs, in her own 11-year-old version of the same instinct. He noticed this and did not comment on it, which seemed to him the right response. The motorboat went into the water on a Saturday morning in late March, with Emma at the bow and Sarah at the stern and Ethan at the engine, and it ran the way that a properly restored 1960s mahogany runabout runs, when someone has done the work correctly, smoothly, and without complaint, with the particular satisfying note of an old engine that has been properly maintained vibrating up through the hull into your hands. They went around the perimeter of the lake twice, and then cut the engine and drifted in the middle, and the water was the color that mountain lake water is in late March, deep and cold and absolutely clear, and the sound of the engine stopping was replaced immediately by the sound of the water and the wind and the birds along the eastern shore, and Emma leaned over the side to look at the bottom and said it was so clear she could see the rocks. Ethan set his hand on the gunwale and felt the motion of the water through the old wood and did not think about anything in particular, which was its own form of clarity.